Sound check. Sound check. 1, 2. He's mute. He's muted.
Oh, you're muted. Wait, right there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we're good to go.
All righty.
Thank you much.
Yes, sir.
You. Bye bye.
So where's the, oh. Okay. Thank you. Test.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our Board of Trustees special meeting on May 25th at 2 p.m. I want to welcome everyone to our meeting. This meeting will be held at the Administrative Service Center and will be visible through an EPCC YouTube channel. You can refer to that channel by going to our link, https://youtube.com/users/goepcc. I want to welcome everyone, and can we get a roll call of the board, please?
Mrs. Robles. Here. Mr. Uxer.
Here?
Ms. Sanchez.
Here.
Dr. Graham.
Here.
Ms. Nahida.
Present.
Mr. Haggerty.
Here. Do we have any public comment?
No, sir.
Okay.
Section 5, discussion items. Item 5.1, Ms. Josette Shaughnessy, Vice President of Financial and Administrative Operations, will update the Board of Trustees on the budget development process for fiscal year 2022-2023.
Good afternoon, Mr. Haggerty, Dr. Serrata, and members of the board. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity one more time, second time actually this year, to update you on the
Set the fire.
Did I say something? Budget alarm.
Are we all
So
supposed
thank
to
you
make
again for giving me the opportunity to present to you, giving you an update on the budget development process for next fiscal year. It's been a little bit over 2 months since I presented to you for the first time on the budget for next year. And so the purpose of this afternoon's meeting is to update you on where we're at for next fiscal year, giving you an update on the HERF awards, and also an update on projected revenue and budget for the current fiscal year, and also an update on the projected revenues that will support the budget for next year. We'll go over the preliminary budget strategies that will move towards the adoption of the budget for next year, and then our next steps. There's a lot of work to be done between now and the time of adoption by the board in August. So as you know, we gave you a budget workshop on March the 23rd, during which time we updated the board on revenue projections, give you an idea what the budget looks like for next year. At the time, we were still compiling the baseline budget, so we do have that updated now as of April the 30th. And that entails actually adjusting the current adopted budget to a baseline budget that for any kind of positions that became vacant during the fiscal year. So as a reminder, any positions that become vacant are now budgeted at the higher level of the entry level for those positions. So that's going to yield some savings that you will see in just a minute. Pending is the review and approval of additional funding requests by the president, and that's based on available funding. And every year during the budget development process, the executive levels are asked to submit any additional budget requests. And so those are vetted during this time, and will continue to be vetted through the time that we present to you in early August. Hopefully we can have another budget workshop to the Board of Trustees so that to prepare you for the adoption of the budget during the regular board meeting in August. So what does the budget development process entail? Well, first and foremost, obviously, we want to make sure that our current fiscal year revenue are sufficient to fund the budget. So it's going to be the basis for the revenue projection for next fiscal year. And will be adjusted based on any kind of enrollment increase or flat enrollment or decline. And this is something we've been challenged with now for the last 2 years since the beginning of the pandemic. Just a reminder that the fiscal year 22-23 is the second year of the biennium, and as such, there is no additional funding from the state. The good news is no decrease in state funding, and it has happened in the past that we've been decreased in state funding in mid-biennium, but this is not the case for this year. Fiscal year 22-23 budget is going to be based on the rollover of this year's adopted budget with some adjustment, as I mentioned earlier. except for the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund reserve, and that one is very much subject to any kind of lost revenue that we may be able to claim from that HER funding. However, based on enrollment, if that enrollment goes up, then obviously that will change that reserve, and we can talk about that in just a while. Additional requests are considered only for essential needs, such as increase in overhead cost, benefits, and other critical services. And certainly our executive levels feel like they have some critical needs, and so that's the purpose of vetting those additional requests to see how we can fund those, assuming that we have additional funding to do so. As always, and it is always a priority of this administration and this board, is to evaluate salary enhancement for our full-time and part-time faculty and staff. It is based on availability of funds, but we try everything we can to see how we can accommodate such a measure for the following fiscal year. As you know, this has been challenging for the last 2 years to grant salary enhancement. 2021, there was no salary enhancement for either category of staff. This fiscal year, 21-22, the board did approve a 2% salary increase, and we did also have a one-time incentive pay that was granted this past December. And so we are looking at now what we can do next year to sort of trying to help relieve the burden on our employees when it comes down to the current inflationary rate that is really affecting all of us. So what strategic planning do we employ when we're looking at the budget? Every year is different. I think you've heard me say that every year. There's not one single year that is exactly the same, and for very good reason. Pretty much depending on our revenue sources, the major revenue sources, which is tuition and fees, obviously is affected by enrollment declines or obviously enrollment improvement. And that's what we're looking at for next year, actually, to see an improvement in our enrollment. So state appropriation is going to remain flat. So that, as I mentioned earlier, there's no additional funding. Our HERF revenue recovery will most likely be adjusted based on projected enrollment increase or decrease, and I'll talk about that in just a minute when we talk about the revenue projections. Tuition and fees is based on the tuition rate schedule that was effective fall of 2020 and current year enrollment. Now, the projections that you're going to see in a minute is based on actual tuition and fees revenue that we collected fall and spring of this fiscal year, and flat enrollment for the summer. Right now, the summer enrollment is trending down. However, we hope there's going to be some improvement, and therefore we'll have to adjust our revenue projections accordingly. It's still pretty, well, it's not too early to tell, but we have about another week to enroll our students. The other thing I wanted to mention is there's no tuition rate increase that is planned for fiscal year 22-23. Technically, this would have represented the year that we look at a new tuition rate schedule, because this is something the board had adopted back in 2016, but in light of the enrollment declines, we feel like a tuition increase for our students just would not be appropriate at this time. So we are most likely going to be holding off for a while to do a tuition rate increase. Property taxes that you will see in a moment, that is based on the current tax levy with some adjustments for refunds, and it is based on the current tax rate of 13.476 cents per $100 valuation. These numbers will change, certainly, because we always wait for our certified valuation before we can, number one, calculate our no new revenue tax rate that will yield the revenue for the following year, but also it helps us evaluate any kind of impact of any refunds on our revenue. So right now, like you will see in just a moment, our tax revenue is based on our current valuation. By the way, the preliminary valuation indicates the valuation to be about over $57 billion. Right now, our valuation is at $48 billion. So it's significantly up, but we know it's going to settle probably downward by the time we're all said and done on July the 25th when we receive our appraisal. When it comes down to planning for additional funding needs, as I mentioned earlier, we always consider salary enhancement for employees. And you will see some of the, some scenarios in a while when we present the budget strategies of what we most likely going to recommend based on our available funding. And of course, our additional funding request is something that we're going to be continuing vetting in the next couple of months. Planning for continued impact of GASB 68 and 65 continue to affect our fund balance, and this is an average $5 million a year that it does impact the fund balance negatively. So we always plan for that, and we hope that any addition, any addition to fund balance this year will mitigate that kind of impact. And then planning for the allocation of the balance in HERF funding, which includes those that funding, those awards that we receive under CARES, CARISA, ARPA, and MSI. So talking about the grant awards, this actually was shared with you last August, and so this is shared with you again this afternoon, included in your presentation. And the only thing that has changed here actually is the extended date. So as you can see, under these awards, we have received a total of a little bit over $122 million. And we have now until June 30th of 2023 to expend the remaining balance that you see in the next slide in your packet. And those grant budgets have been allocated, as you can see right now. We have expended all of the funds for the students. So anything that was allocated for student aid has been expended to date. We still have some funds that are remaining under the ARPA and under the MSI. And the minority serving institution, the good news, assuming we want to exercise that option, is that now it can be used for construction. And it can be used for construction of facilities that will aid students to deal with the effect of the pandemic. And so right now, the task force actually was meeting yesterday. So as of now, we are looking at allocating that $38.7 million that is remaining as of May 17th. And as always, we prioritize first to cover those costs that are related to transitioning to online education, whether it is for students or for employees. We also look at recouping our lost revenue. And this has been pretty significant in the last 2 years, that lost revenue. This year, we had budgeted about $9.7 million. And we are looking actually at recouping closer to $15 million. Now, as a reminder, anything that we recoup in lost revenue is not there to sustain our operating budget. It is set aside only to cover one-time type of expense. In other words, not something that's going to be recurring every year, because we always aim at having you adopt a sustainable budget. This is very important because obviously you don't want to have to worry about finding the funding the next few years when you've been funding all this time recurring costs with federal dollars that are going to expire eventually. So we try to be very strategic in the way that we plan for those funds. So that $38.7 million is being discussed, how we're going to spend it between now and next June of 2023. And we have our task force that is composed of our cabinet and our grants management office employees that really help us strategize on how we are going to do that. So we were talking about revenue projections for this current fiscal year, and I was talking about the HERF revenue recovery. So as you can see from this slide here that shows the first column is your adopted budget. So those revenues that are sustaining the budget as you adopted it last August, as compared to what is projected for this year. And how are we going to be faring at the end of this fiscal year? We're actually fairly well. And the reason why we are going to be faring fairly well is not necessarily because we are recovering the lost revenue, because again, this is not used for ongoing operation, but it is because our tuition and fees actually, even though we are looking at a decrease of about $1.3 million for this year's revenue as compared to what was budgeted. It is offset by the property tax revenue that is coming in higher than when we had budgeted. And there's a reason for that. If you recall, whenever I present to the board, we're very conservative when we project property tax revenue. I don't know if you're familiar, if you recall last year when I tried to explain, it's not easy to explain, but when I tried to explain is that the CAD does not include those Chapter 42 properties in their valuation. So therefore, when we compute the tax rate on the valuation, it yields an amount of revenue, tax revenue lower than actually what's going to go out to the taxpayers. So what we yield when we do the calculation in August, based on the certified valuation that do not include those property valuations, the amount of revenue is going to be slightly lower than what actually goes out to the taxpayers in October. So those Chapter 42 properties are included in the tax bill going to the taxpayers, and then upon settlement of those Chapter 42 cases, then the amount is refunded to the taxpayer. So the good news here, the $67.1 million actually includes whatever we have collected this year in tax revenue, minus any kind of estimated refunds that we still anticipate through the end of the fiscal year. So we hope that we're going to have $1.7 million more than what we actually had budgeted. And that fares very well for next fiscal year because this revenue then gets basically projected, the same kind of revenue gets projected for next fiscal year. Other income is expected to come in a little bit lower than anticipated due to some decrease in some rental income. So when we look at the total operating revenue for this year, what is highlighted in yellow, it's a little bit over $147 million, or an increase of $468,000 over this adopted. Again, this is preliminary. This picture could change. But the good news is we also are very, very cautious about how we expand the adopted budget. So we anticipate some significant savings, and I'm going to show you in just a while.
Ms. Shaughnessy?
Yes, sir.
John, real quick, a variance of almost 30% in the projected revenues for this year overhead. What's that due to?
Oh, yes, sir. On the overhead recovery, this actually we anticipate to receive more revenue from indirect costs on grants and contracts, Mr. Uxer. That's what this is about. The extra $157,000 has to do with anticipated overhead recovery on grants and contracts, whether it's federal or state grants. And most likely this is related to HARF funding. Am I correct, Mr. Flores? Does that answer your question?
Just out of curiosity,
Yes, sir.
the overhead recovery from grants and stuff, is that a one-time expense, or are we going to put that into the baseline as a projected a solid projected recovery as an ongoing?
Sir, the overhead recovery is budgeted every year. This is always a solid revenue that comes in.
Okay.
And again, it's very much based on the number of grants and contracts and also the percentage that we can recover from those grants and contracts. Some grants and contracts have, let's say, an 8% recovery cost. Some other contracts are a little bit higher. Some of it are lower. So it's pretty much based on what the specific grant and contracts stipulates.
But if all of a sudden all of our grants take a dumper, then we're going to have to go back and look at that, I guess. Okay, good enough.
So regarding these revenues, this is what's sustaining our current adopted budget. And I know this is a very busy slide. When it comes down to transparency, this is very transparent, actually, because this shows you the anticipated projected revenue, about $148.8 million. And then when you compare that to the total expenses of $125.1 million, then we anticipate to have an increase in fund balance, which is really represents your surplus, your excess of revenue over expenses about $18.6 million. And I would submit to you this is actually very conservative. So one thing is that one thing that the board is looking at is making sure that obviously that not only the budget is balanced, but we also staying within the confines of this budget. And I can tell you that for the end of the fiscal year, this is exactly what we're going to be doing with a surplus. Now, this surplus is obviously due to some very significant savings that we anticipate in salary savings from vacancies. As you know, we had some significant retirements this year. We also had other resignations. And so, as I mentioned earlier, when that happens, the incumbent salary is budgeted at a lower salary and therefore then generates some savings. We also have some savings, significant savings in part-time faculty salaries. Those are variable costs. And our part-time faculty pools have not been really significantly reduced over the years. And the reason we do that is because we want to make sure that we have the pool of money available if the enrollment does increase. We want to be able to fund those part-time faculty that are teaching additional sections. So right now, with an enrollment decline, it would make sense that we would have a saving in part-time faculty salaries. We also have some savings in the contingency fund that we call institutional clearing, and about $550,000. So when everything is all said and done, without even looking at any other savings in the budget, and we know there are some other savings in the budget because our budget heads try to be very frugal, and we don't go shopping just because we have the money. We go shopping because we have the needs, but not because we want to spend the money that's in our budget. So again, I'm always very pleased at the end of the fiscal year. It certainly makes my job easier, makes me feel I sleep a whole lot better when we know we're going to balance the budget. And certainly we're going to have additional savings to put into fund balance. And having a fund balance is extremely important. As you know, SAC-COC looks at that very seriously for sustainability, for financial viability of an entity, and of course our rating agencies also look at that very seriously. So
Ms. Shaughnessy?
Yes, sir.
Again, real quick, so that 13 mil variance in institutional accounts is primarily associated with personnel salaries, if you will.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And again, this does not even look at any other savings in the budget. We certainly don't look at every budget, every executive level budget to make sure that they are within the confines. They know their responsibility, and so we don't look at but those are the big ticket items, if you will, that we know that we feel like we're going to realize by the end of the fiscal year. So when looking at revenue projections for next year, very preliminary. So I want to emphasize that, throughout this presentation, that these numbers are very preliminary. We do our best to project those numbers. If anything, it's conservative versus being liberal, because we want to make sure that obviously we're not expending more than we're supposed to based on the revenues that we have. So as I mentioned earlier, our state appropriations are going to remain the same. HERF revenue recovery, at this time we don't know if it's going to be going further down or if it's going to have to go further up because of any kind of enrollment trends, either decline or increases. We did adjust that revenue recovery fund by $1.5 million. And why is that? Well, so as you are aware, we are starting our face-to-face classes in the fall, which means that we can now charge the distance education fee. And which in the past 2 years now, has been recouped through the HERF funding, because we were allowed to do so. Well, in this case now, because we're able to charge it back to our students, then we are then obviously decreasing that revenue recovery by that estimated amount that we anticipate charging back to our students for the next fiscal year. Obviously, should there be a change in that, then we would then adjust accordingly. But right now, that's the plan. So that 1.5 now is included in the tuition and fees line item. So when you look at the local funds, which obviously very important to us because this is really how we get any kind of additional revenue. Our two major revenue sources are under our local funds. And so tuition and fees here is reflected based on current enrollment, does not include any anticipation of enrollment increase, which we'll be able to assess sometime in early August when we present to you. We'll have a much better understanding about fall enrollment, which is always a very good indicator than for the following semesters. Which is also very important this year is for our fall enrollment to pan out higher because we are in a base year. And as you know, this is also going to determine our state funding for the following biennium. So extremely important that we continue our obviously our recruitment, our student recruitment efforts. But tuition and fees here are projected to be above what we have budgeted for this year. And so this is a combination of a decrease in tuition that we experienced this year, now netted by the distance education fee revenue that we anticipate. Property taxes here is showing $1 million higher than the previous slide, and the reason why is because we are also anticipating to get an additional $1 million on new property, notwithstanding any increase in in tax rate. So this only shows the $2.7 million is just the increase over what we have budgeted for this year, includes what I've explained earlier in a previous slide, plus $1 million additional revenue based on additional new property, based on the current tax rate. So I want to make sure that everybody understands here, this does not mean that we're having a tax rate increase. It just means that we are anticipating more tax revenue that is budgeted for next year. Other income, that's the good news. So other income, as you can see, was budgeted this year at 1.9. We are budgeting that at 3.1. And the reason why is we are anticipating higher interest income. As you know, for the last 2 years, the investment market has really been suffering from very, low interest rates. As you know, we invest very conservatively. And so when last year for this current year, we actually computed interest income based on interest rates of anywhere from 0 to about 10 basis points. This interest income here that's including the 3.1 million, this is going to be based on interest income anywhere from 50 basis points to 125 basis points. And this is actually pretty conservative. And when I say 125 basis points, that means 1.25%. We're hoping it might even go up to 2%. We don't know. I mean, maybe Dr. Serrata can address that better because he has that kind of information, but really we think like we are very conservative, but we would rather be conservative. Obviously, interest income is something that is very volatile, and so we think that we can bring in an additional $1.1 million above what we projected for this current year. So when you look at the total operating budget, now we are looking at an increase over this year's revenue, about $3.3 million. This is pretty significant when we've been really struggling for the last 2 years to balance a budget without having to take some pretty difficult budgetary decisions, such as cutting positions like we did in 2021. As a reminder, in 2021, we froze about $6 million worth of vacant position. We're not talking about incumbents here, vacant position, and we froze about $1 million of travel, okay? For this current fiscal year, you allowed us to restore about $500,000 in travel and about $500,000 in frozen position, which, by the way, we have funded. So again, for next year, we're really looking at being in a better position than we were this year. So the next slide kind of shows you the distribution in a chart context. So you can see, you've seen those charts before. I'm preaching to the choir here. You've seen those kind of that distribution of revenue sources, but the trend continues where property taxes are our main source of revenue, about 44% of that total revenue sources of $153 million, followed by tuition and fees of $38.3 million, or a little bit over 25% of those revenue sources, and then in third place, state appropriation, about $31.6 million, or a little bit over 20% of these revenue sources. You can see the HERF revenue recovery is budgeted at about $8.2 million. And again, this will for sure change one way or another by next time that we present. It's either going to go up if our enrollment keeps on declining, or it's going to go down because we have improvement in the enrollment. So we were talking about the baseline budget earlier, and this is just an illustration of the baseline budget. This is sorted here by executive level. This shows the movement of any kind of reallocation in between executive levels or within executive levels, but certainly between executive levels. And really the reason for this movement here is because mainly if you look, for example, at the financial and administrative operation, the 1.1 million decrease in that, in my division is not because I'm very generous, but it's really because we reallocated some budgets that were initially budgeted in that division, namely the travel budget, that the $500,000 that we restored initially was budgeted in my division, and then during the fiscal year got reallocated to the various executive levels based on a prorated basis. And we also funded those frozen positions, another $500,000. So that certainly account for most of the $1.2 million. But the bottom line, the net effect of those reallocation here is that we are showing a surplus as you compare the baseline budget, which would be this column right here. So when you compare the baseline budget to the adopted budget, there is a surplus of $690,000, which means that going forward, if we were to adopt this budget here as it is now, we would have a decrease in the budget about $690,000. So that's really going to give us some capacity going forward for next year. I know this is a lot of information, so if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to stop me.
Ms. Shaughnessy, I just have one question on
Sure.
the funds for the research accreditation and planning. Does that include what we've already spent on the policies and TESB?
Yes, ma'am. There is a provision in there. Dr. Penley may disagree, I don't know, but I believe it does.
Yes, the TASB expenses are included in my budget.
Thank you.
So when if we're looking now at starting, like I said, as of now, the baseline budget is $690,000 lower than the adopted budget. And as we progress towards August, and as we have more resignations or more retirements, that baseline budget is also going to decline even further. We could end up with a much higher surplus than this $690,000. So we'll find out by the time that we present to you in August. The next charts is something that you have there for your information. Just wanted to maybe point out a couple of things on this expenditure that's by function. So as always, we look at how is instruction funded as compared to the overall budget. In general, when we look at instruction and academic support, that usually totals about 50% of our budget, with this way it should be. In this case, it's a little bit lower, and by the way, we don't have benefits in there either. So when we take instruction plus academic support plus the related benefits, usually that equals about 50% of the total budget. In this case, institutional support is a little bit higher, is because it contains the HERF reserve. And there's a HERF reserve in there, about $9.7 million that I mentioned earlier, and it sits in institutional support as one-time kind of expense if needed, but if it does not get spent, then it's saved at the end of the fiscal year. So once we have expended all that HERF funding, actually you will see a change in that expenditure makeup by function. Regarding by expense category, this is also a very interesting, it's always a very interesting slide because it really shows the relationship in our budget between our salaries and our other expenditures. And so when you look at total salaries, faculty salaries, plus your staff salaries, plus your benefits, that makes up about 70% of the budget as of today. And if we exclude actually the HERF reserve that sits in that contingency fund of $10 million, it's closer to about like 75 or 76%. So, you know, when we look at obviously reducing our budget, this is where, unfortunately, sometimes we have to go because that's where your costs are. As you can see here, the travel that was restored brings it up about $680,000. We're still about $600,000 off than what we used to be. Everything else pretty much remained the same. All the vacant positions that are funded do reside under either under faculty salaries or under staff salaries, and those some of those are already under recruitment and will continue to be under recruitment. So let's look at next year, and I have about a couple more slides on this presentation that are really critical to this presentation. And so when we look at the additional requests for next fiscal year, we're still vetting those. It's a little bit more complicated because we do have some requests that are also aiming at being funded by HERF, so we want to make sure we don't have any duplication on either side. And we also want to make sure that whatever is being requested to be funded by HERF is also going to be funded by a sustainable budget going forward. So those discussions need to occur, and they will occur between now and the time that we present to you again. But when we look at critical needs, now we call them must be funded, critical needs. So I kind of reworded that to be critical needs versus must be funded. Central appraisal district fees. They must be funded. We don't have a choice. They just pass their budget, and they pass it on to the taxing entities, and that budget went up to the tune of us having to add another $65,000. That total budget actually is going to end up being about $900,000, by the way, for the Central Appraisal District. And we are being charged based, obviously, on our, our share with the other taxing entities. Critical needs, so we would like to restore funding for critical frozen position. So there's going to be a request of the VPs to actually prioritize what they have on the list of the positions that were frozen. And when we say frozen, those are unfunded. They continue to be unfunded. And we're talking about $5 million worth of positions that are still unfunded. Some of them may not be critically needed, but others may be. And so we need to have that discussion. And here, this is just a suggestion. It could be maybe that once we have reviewed those positions, we feel like we need a little bit more money than $500,000. But we need to have that discussion. So that will be occurring very soon. We're also requesting to restore the travel budget. And again, travel budget is kind of a misnomer. It's not that we just want to travel. Bottom line is, unfortunately, to attend training or to attend conferences that are not held virtually anymore, we're having to travel. So obviously that means airfares, that means hotel costs, that means obviously registration costs. And so we are asking for that travel budget to be restored. It could be that next time we meet, this looks a little different because we have found that maybe we just do this, we handle this differently. Now, there are other funding requests.
I have a question before
Sure.
we move on. Under the restore the funding for the critical frozen positions, so I recall a conversation maybe about 2 budget cycles ago where, I don't know, I recall that there were a handful of positions that I believe had not been filled for quite some time. Were any of those part of this allocation here, or is the evaluation still ongoing?
No, it's a great question, Ms. Sanchez. So none of them would be there because we froze a significant amount of resources. This is $500,000 from the original approximately $5 million that we froze. So those would not be there. We will continue to look at those respective positions and look at whether we continue to see a need for those.
Okay, so these are not part of the 500?
No, ma'am.
Can you give examples of what some of the critical frozen positions are? Or if you recall off the top of your head? If not, we can
Sure.
get it later.
So we have several frozen positions that were, so back when the pandemic hit and we came before the board to balance the budget for fiscal year 2021, those happened to be, the number was like over $6 million. They just happened to be vacant, and we just said, okay, as of today, this is frozen. Now, it affected every division in the district. It affected instruction, as long as, of course, it did not affect, obviously, the delivery of instruction, okay, which point we did fund that. But obviously, some services, everybody had to do more with less. So it was really a significant impact. I mean, in my area, I had a coordinator for employee relation, I had a payroll specialist, I had, I'm trying to recall, IC manager. I mean, there was a myriad, you know, a lot of, some of them were support services, some were, in terms of instruction, though, we did not freeze anything that to prevent any delivery of instruction. That we made sure that was funded. But everything else that had not been funded in quite a while that was not deemed necessary was frozen.
And was there an exercise conducted to really review and do the evaluation?
Absolutely.
To make that determination if it was truly necessary moving forward, at least a process in place? You all did that?
Yes, ma'am. The cabinet met, and we met virtually, obviously, during the pandemic. We reviewed those respective positions, and then there was a negotiation with regards to the specific positions that cabinet members felt were absolutely critical. But we did, at that point, we erred on the side of being more frugal, and we froze positions as we were at that particular point in time.
So were there any positions as part of that exercise that you all said no to?
Gosh.
I'm just trying to get a sense,
No,
like, you know, that
understood.
there was just an evaluation that was done, because and let me tell you why I'm thinking this. I mean, I know other organizations have had to go back to really reevaluate, you know, we were able to do the same level of work, for example, with less positions, and I'm just thinking in terms of the budget, just kind of how we could be mindful of those things. So that's really what I'm trying to get at, just that there was a process and a procedure that was done that was really meaningful in the sense, like, we're not, and I'm just, for example, like, we're not just signing off and saying, yeah, we need all of this, we need to go back to where we were prior to the pandemic, but that it really was at least a time to have a meaningful review of positions.
No, I think that's
Right?
fair.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yes, ma'am. I think that's fair, and this is part of the discussion where Ms. Shaughnessy says you see the funding for requests from the executive levels. Those will entail a conversation with myself and each of the vice presidents, looking at what's frozen, looking at being able to say, okay, you can swap these particular positions. This is more important to your respective area now than this was in the past. So we can swap positions if we need to. And that'll help me reduce this number from 3.5 significantly lower. Because we do still have a significant number of positions, not only that are frozen, we have a significant number of positions that are unfilled and that have been unfilled for a period of time. Some have legitimate reasons, you know, there's a difficulty in finding that respective skill. It is in high demand throughout the region and the state. So some of those positions we'll have to reevaluate, and we'll negotiate with each of the respective divisions to come to a consensus on what we really need and what we swap out.
There's a lot of work to be done between now. Just having that conversation with Dr. Sadata. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of work to be done.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So in reviewing the other funding request, what you see here before you is the actual amounts that were requested And there were several, there were about, the various executive levels requested a total about $5 million. And we split them between what we call multi-year requests, in other words, recurring type of funding that is needed every year versus one-time funding that we can fund from savings during the fiscal year or through a fund that is earmarked for that purpose. So one-time funding requires just that dollar to be expended during that one time, and that was it. It's not going to be needed in the future. Whereas what you see before you, those were actually $3.5 million worth of multi-year or requests that the funding affects multi-year basically into the future. So again, we are vetting them. We're going to be, as you heard Dr. Serrata, he's going to be meeting with each vice president to kind of hear the justification for this request. And again, it's going to be subject also to availability of funds and priority. So what is most priority, for example, in information technology? What is most priority in instruction in workforce education, so on and so forth? There's also, we want to make sure there is no duplication here of funding requests. If something can be funded through her funds, if it's one time, then it gets taken care of that way. Or we have a plan to fund it through her funds for next year, and then the following fiscal year, we have a plan to continue funding something that needs to be funded. We know that we cannot be committing to funding something through her funds that's going to continue for several years and not having a good plan in place. So again, having a sustainable budget going forward. Does that make sense?
Shaughnessy, I have a question, Dr. Serrata. So what's the process that is being used to align the request for funding to the goals that we have, identified as a board and that we are all supposed to be working towards? There's got to be a way that we align those so that whatever funding is requested and approved is supporting the goals that the institution has as identified.
No, Dr. Graham, it's a great point as well, and it does. I mean, we, not only to the point of the funding of those respective positions, but we tie them back to the institutional effectiveness plans as well and what the goals of the board are. So in fairness, I have not seen. I have not seen any of our, any of the vice president areas request something that's completely out of context with the goals of the board.
So does that mean that all of them are familiar with the goals that we have? I know that we've talked about revisiting that and having another retreat to make sure that we update whatever we need to update, but I think that it's critical that the funding is aligned to the goals that we are, striving to meet collectively.
Absolutely, Dr. Graham, yes.
Yes, Dr. Graham, the strategic plan, we continued, we moved that forward. Dr. Penley and her team with the board as well as with all of the members of cabinet contributed to that. So even during the pandemic, essentially at the height of the pandemic in our particular region is when we rolled out our new strategic plan, the 21 through 25 strategic plan, and the goals were aligned with the vision of the board.
Thank you.
So going forward with those other funding requests of almost $3.6 million, they will be considered, they will be evaluated, they will be vetted, they will be, and then some of these requests will make it for funding and others will probably not, because we would have to come up with $3.6 million.
And one of the things that I'd like to add is in regards to the travel budget is that I think that a lot of the progress the college has made has been because people get outside of the area and look and see what everybody else is doing and then come back and make it even better.
Absolutely. Yes.
So that, to me, that's very important that we provide those opportunities.
And that's the reason why I mentioned earlier, we call it the travel budget, but it really has a purpose behind it, which is obviously to be updated on any kind of, I know in my area, obviously the changes in best practices, in rules, changes in rules and regulation, Title IX training. I mean, there's all a gamut accreditation, obviously, a lot of other type of conferences, police department training. This is obviously, anything related to safety needs to be taken into consideration. So definitely would not be coming before you to restore a travel budget if we felt like it was not, crucial.
And it goes beyond learning, because yes, you're right, you have to go learn new rules, regulations, and your demands and all that, but it also gives people the opportunity to get away and think outside the box and see what else is going on everywhere that
Best
we need
practices.
to bring back.
Definitely. Thank you. So we are arriving at one of the very last slides of the presentation. You'll be relieved to know. The funding strategies for next year. What are we looking at based on salary increase scenarios? Because again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, I believe that Dr. Serrata is very intent on proposing a salary increase that is meaningful to our employees. And so in order to do that, what kind of funding do we have available to certainly make sure that we balance our budget and still able to afford a salary increase that's going to be affecting the base salary? This is not one time. This would affect the base salaries going forward, and you cannot take it back. Well, you could take it back, but that wouldn't be very popular, would it? So really, here what you have before you is various scenarios of funding a salary enhancement based on our current budget picture. So just to kind of explain this slide here, the very first row is your total projected revenue. This is based on what I presented earlier, a little bit over $153 million of revenue to fund a baseline budget right now, still preliminary, about $149.1 million that is being adjusted by the $1.5 million that I had mentioned earlier. So we reduced the HERF revenue recovery by 1.5. We need to do the same thing on the side of the expenditure budget. So in total, you're looking at a preliminary budget surplus about $5.5 million. So $5.5 million, what is that going to fund? So all scenarios, anywhere from no salary increase to a salary increase of 5%. And again, this is just a scenario, okay? So when you consider that $5.5 million surplus, and you consider the critical needs that I just outlined a while ago, a little bit over $1 million, then what do you have left to fund a salary enhancement, let's say of 1%? You would have about $3.5 million left if you gave a 1% salary enhancement. Of course, 1% is not going to go very far for our employees, but you would have $3.5 million to fund any kind of additional requests. Because this yellow line there, it's before any additional requests. Remember, we have additional requests about $3.5 million. We know most likely we cannot fund $3.5 million, but it's just to give you an idea here what we would be looking at. A salary increase of 2% would give you a budget surplus about $2.6 million. A 3% salary increase, $1.7 million, a little bit over that. And then a 4% increase would give you a budget surplus about $852,000. And then when you look at 5%, we have a small deficit. And I say small because $52,000, my pocketbook would be very high, but for the college, $52,000 is something we certainly can find in the budget. So again, these are just preliminary numbers, and they are subject to change. If our enrollment goes up, that's going to change the whole.
I think we need to take the word "if" out of the equation.
I'm sorry?
We need to take the word "if" out of the equation when the enrollment goes up. Think about it. If we had 10,000 more students, what would that do to the budget? What would that give us the opportunity to increase salary and,
Absolutely.
If we had 10,000 students, if every employee recruited 2 or 3, we would reach that goal.
Totally agree with you, Dr. Graham. I actually would be very happy if it went back to pre-pandemic levels, because here you're looking at a HERF lost revenue recovery that is going all the way down. And then now you see your tuition and fees revenue going up, and then obviously, we would be in very good shape.
And $52,000 isn't a lot, but is it sustainable? Is it something
It is
that
sustainable,
yearly
yes.
is going to not be a problem?
It is sustainable, absolutely.
Thank you.
So this is really information for you to digest and to kind of prepare you for a budget workshop that I would recommend in early August, so that then when the budget adoption is ready for you, or the budget is ready for you to be adopted at the August regular meeting, then you obviously have all the information that you need to make a very informed decision. This spreadsheet, this slide in front of you is regarding any additional revenue from property tax increase if we chose to go that route, because truly it's needed, and at this point, as you've seen the numbers, maybe a very small tax increase might be needed, but we don't know yet at this point. We certainly don't want, we're not saying that it will happen, but we certainly need to keep that as an option, because we're not doing a tuition increase, and we have not done a tax increase in quite a few years. And you know that this administration never recommends a tax increase unless absolutely necessary. We do stay away from that kind of recommendation. So here, these numbers are very preliminary because this is based on the current valuation, current tax rate, and I can guarantee you these numbers are going to somewhat change. Now, the increase in the revenue for 1%, that's not going to change drastically, because as you know, as your valuation goes up, your non-new revenue tax rate goes down. So it yields basically the same amount of revenue, okay? But those numbers will change in terms of where your tax rate is going to sit at. So right now, the beginning here to extrapolate on the tax rate increase is based on 13.47 cents per $100 valuation. But the bottom line here is, as our valuation goes up, that non-new revenue tax rate is going to go down, guaranteed. And so your tax rate that are derived from the different rate percentages is going to be lower than what you see right here. Okay? Next step, well, as Dr. Graham said, you know, we really need to be very active about continue recruiting our students, and so this is exactly what is happening as we speak. We continue our recruitment efforts for both summers and fall registration. We want to revise and refine our revenue projections. We need to refine our plan for allocating the unexpended HERF funds. As I demonstrated earlier, we need to update our baseline budget for additional salary savings, review additional funding requests, review the needed critical position, compute the non-new revenue tax rate as soon as we have our certified valuation in July, late July, and then we need to prepare for the final budget workshop for the Board of Trustees. As you can see, a lot of work to be done between now and early August. June 30th, we're going to get another property appraisal and preliminary tax rate. July 25th, we anticipate to receive our certified property appraisal. Actually, that's the latest day by law that it can provide that information. At that time, we will finalize our tax revenue projection. We will compute our non-new revenue tax rate. And then in early August, we hope to be the last budget workshop to the Board of Trustees with consideration of salary enhancement at that same meeting, because we would like to proceed with implementing that in time for when faculty starts the semester. And then in August, the August board meeting, as I mentioned earlier, the adoption of the budget. And then the board will also consider the adoption of the tax rate either in August or in September, depending on what happens with our recommendation. Thank you so much for your attention and your support. Yes, sir.
Dr. Shaughnessy, Ms. Shaughnessy, I just have one comment. I think it's a general overview. I think if we look at the budget, look at the expenditures, I think we need to keep in mind that this money is not ours. What we're doing is reallocating money that we're taking from everybody else. We're taking money, we get money from the property tax. In other words, we're taking it from the community that way. And then we get money from the student fees, and we take money from there. And then the state takes money from everybody, and then they allocate us. So everybody's allocating us some funds, but these are not our, I think we sit there and we look at this budget and I have $1 million, or this is $100 million, or I have this, or I have that. We don't have anything. what we do is we're reallocating it. If we want to give extra money here or extra money there, what we're doing is, hey, if we want to increase something, we're taking it from the company. We're taking it from the community. It's just we keep the philosophy that we're reallocating and we're using the money of those people that elected us. So we need to keep that, that in mind, that we also have a fiduciary responsibility to treat the monies that are allocated to us, that we don't sell groceries or grow things or make things, okay? We make students, yes, but we allocate funds that everybody else gives us, the community gives us. Okay, so if we're gonna make an enhancement or anything else, we need to understand the impact back on the community too. Those are the people that elected us.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Anybody have any other questions? Okay, we need to read 5.2.
Item 5.2.
Thank you, Ms. Shaughnessy.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Discussion and take possible action regarding the investment or use of the 30 million charitable grant to the college from the National Philanthropic Trust.
I think we're going to go into executive session. Can you read that, please?
The Board of Trustees may conduct an executive or closed session pursuant to Chapter 551 of the Texas Government Code for one or more of the following reasons. 1, consultation with its attorney to seek or receive legal advice or consultation regarding pending or contemplated litigation or for any purpose authorized by law. 2, discussion about the value or transfer of real property. 3, discussion about a prospective gift or donation. 4, consideration of specific personnel matters. 5, discussion about security, personnel, or devices. Or 6, discussion of certain economic development matters. The board may also announce that it will go into executive session on any item listed on this agenda if the subject matter is permitted for a closed session by provisions of Chapter 551 of the Texas Government Code. Any vote regarding these items shall be taken in open session. Item 6.1, discussion with legal counsel regarding a charitable grant to the college of $30 million from the National Philanthropic Trust pursuant to Section 551.073 of the Texas Government Code. The time is now 3:12 p.m.
So we are returning from executive session, and we are on item 5.2. Josh Haggerty stepped out for a little bit, so will you read 5.2, please?
Item 5.2, discussion and take possible action regarding the investment or use of the $30 million charitable grant to the college from the National Philanthropic Trust.
No action.
And there is no action that I. So
can adjourn.
that's it. We are, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So made.
Okay.
All right, adjourned.
Thank you.